Mr. President. Well, here we go again. It seems to me that every time we should be talking about the horrible budget that the governor has done, there's some distraction bill that comes. Except this bill is beyond a distraction. It's an insult. It's an insult to women in this state. And frankly, Mr. President, I hope that every man and every woman in this body recognizes that if they vote yes for this bill, that they are voting to make a woman's medical decision for her. You shouldn't be doing that. Remember, small government? This issue is a very personal one for many of us here today. It's so personal because we are all a product of a pregnancy that went right. I could stand here all day and tell you my own story. I could tell you about my great son. I could tell you about the pregnancy. I could tell you about how early he was. I could tell you about the things that went wrong in my mother's pregnancy with me. I could tell you a number of things. But Mr. President, not every pregnancy ends in the ability for someone to be born, someone to be healthy. Abortions are not because I think it was once said by the author that it was the thing to do in the 60s. I don't know that that ever was so. Abortion late in pregnancy is very rare. As a matter of fact, I believe in committee it was brought up that in the state, 89. And every one because of a woman's medical condition. 1% of all abortions happen after 20 weeks. 1%. But we're creating legislation to make decisions for women and to make decisions for doctors, not even based on medical information. And when those choices happen, when those women and their doctors make decisions, it's because they did and they used the medical options that are available. When men and women in this room vote today in favor of this bill, Mr. President, I hope that you're aware that you're making a very personal medical choice for people you don't even know. That you don't know their circumstances. You're not going to do anything for them. Instead, I hope that you will all join me and my colleagues, frankly, in being more sensitive and taking this issue a lot more seriously than you are. You know, I find it insulting because who are you to make choices for others? Mr. President, I find it even more insulting when I heard my governor, I'm going to call it a mansplaining instead of explanation, on why rape and incest victims are not exempted from this bill. I mean, I think that most people who are concerned about that, he said, is in the initial months where they're most concerned about it. Really? You don't know individual circumstances and what may or may not take people to those places. Mr. President, I have just one question I wish I could ask the governor. How does he know what goes on in the minds of pregnant women? who have been raped or who have experienced incest, who are survivors. How does he know? Yeah, as a survivor myself, I find it insulting. There's more, Mr. President. I hope that the people in this room understand that in Walker's world, in your world, a man should be able to sue a doctor under this bill, but a woman can no longer have, frankly, I'm wondering, does she have that right? Because a doctor is put in a situation that he may not be able to do medically what he deems most appropriate between he and she. You know, the Budget Committee met for weeks and suggested that we get out of the doctor's office and get out of women's private lives. Or I'm saying that I suggest that we get out of their private lives. We met for weeks about a whole bunch of stuff. But today, we're standing here and we're talking about whether or not you should be in a woman's choice with her doctor, whether or not she should almost have to be on a deathbed or in a most medically challenged situation before a doctor can make the choices to do what's right. Instead of dealing with jobs, instead of dealing with the fact that we're the worst in the nation for innovation for businesses, instead of dealing with the issues that hundreds of people came and told us at budget hearings, which is deal with the issue of health care and deal with the issue of family care, deal with the issue of IRIS, deal with the issue of accepting the Medicaid dollars. Instead, we're doing some extremist legislation that puts you in the decision-making place for a woman and her doctor, to make it more challenging for a doctor to be able to make the decisions with a woman. And it really is ironic because the disregard that you just showed, Mr. President, is the disregard that you show for the women. Yes, I wish Wisconsin I saw you, so that the women of Wisconsin could see the utter disregard that you have for them and their rights. It's shameful, it's insulting that someone who has to endure incest or rape cannot make the choices for themselves, that their medical conditions have to be almost on death. And that in those situations, Mr. President, will that woman be able to sue her doctor if something goes wrong? I tried to go in the back and breathe through this moment, because as I looked at the emails that I got in, there was one woman who wrote a story, and I don't know, it may have been shared by others, but I found it so touching because she's trying to get you to understand that stuff happens, and the last individuals that should be making choices for the women of Wisconsin and their doctors is anybody in this room. She said, Senator, I'm writing to you to share my personal story regarding the birth and the death of my son Benjamin. With the pending legislation on abortion in the state, I believe that it is important that you hear how much legislation may impact women and their families. In March of 2002, early in the second trimester of my fourth pregnancy, I started experiencing bleeding, which landed me on bed rest for the remainder of the month. And despite an ultrasound that indicated nothing was wrong and extreme care during the month, on March 27th of 2002, my water broke. At this point, I was towards the end of my 18th week pregnancy and felt very much connected to my son. He had been kicking me vigorously all month, and even my 18-month-old daughter understood that a baby was in mommy's tummy. Unfortunately, when one's water breaks this early in a pregnancy, both the mother and the baby are doomed unless action is taken. Infection can be fatal to both, and it sets in quickly, often within 24 hours. My husband and I were informed that we had the option of placing me in a secure isolation chamber to ward off infection so as to continue the pregnancy. But we were also informed that even in an extremely rare case my body could continue to support the pregnancy, our son had virtually no chance. Since the fluid is critical for lung development, the babies born to women who have prematurely ruptured the membrane those children usually have severe breathing problems and short lives. Live births in prom cases, which is, what they call early breaking water cases, usually have severe breathing problems, but in those cases, they only document that the pregnancies that have gone to about 18 weeks. In my case, the attending doctor relayed that a live birth was really only theoretically possible, and that given the risk of infection to me, he would not advise attempting to continue the pregnancy. Despite our grief at the impending loss of our third pregnancy, especially so late, we came to the conclusion that moving to the isolation chamber was not the best option, and that we would let nature take its course. We did not fully understand at the time that letting nature take its course would result in both me and my son's death. Instead, we had to decide whether or not to actively induce labor or to schedule a dilation, an extraction procedure, a D&E, or D&C as some call it. We were advised to do one, and quickly, so as to avoid the infection that would most certainly come. Although it was only one day/night, it seemed like it was an eternity. My husband and I decided that we would induce labor. We weighed absolutely everything in this decision, including the impact on my daughter and the potential trauma for our son, who at this point was still kicking strongly. My health and safety, as well as the emotional trauma of a drawn-out ordeal. Eventually, even though we knew our chosen option was one, less safe in regards to my own health, two, more painful for me, and three, regarded a longer hospital stay, and four, my son would be stillborn. I wanted a chance to hold my son and say goodbye in person. Confident in our decision, we informed our doctor, and it was then that we found out that despite our thoughtfulness, regardless this impossible situation, we would be forced to wait 24 hours to start the process of inducing labor, since it constituted a termination of the pregnancy. Despite the facts that the pregnancy was already doomed, potentially lethal injection was approaching, and we viewed waiting as simply added agony in an already impossible situation. The law forced us to wait another day. During the next 24 hours, infection set in, and I was admitted to the hospital with IV and antibiotics. Labor was eventually induced, and after 32 hours, I delivered my son. Yes, I'm sure you can imagine this was very traumatic event in my life. I made decisions during that last week of March of 2002 with my husband, and in consideration of our family. We felt that despite our strong connection to our unborn son, we needed to make decisions for the future and in the interests of our strong and healthy 18-month-old daughter who needed her mother. It isn't easy to make a decision to induce labor that you know will result in the death of your baby, and it doesn't come lightly. The insult of being told that despite our careful consideration of all the facts and emotions involved, we needed another 24 hours to think about it. Still makes my blood pressure rise, she says. The thought that the additional insult of forcing women to hear that their baby might feel pain during a termination is more than I can bear. Certainly, most people will find my story sympathetic. She didn't say this part, but clearly not this outer circle. There are those that will argue that a few cases, such as mine, will be extreme exceptions, and that this is worth insulting people like me, because most late terminations do not occur under such sympathetic circumstances. Others will point out that my case isn't even relevant, since the death of my son occurred prior to the 20 weeks of pregnancy. This is my response to such arguments. First, is that if my membranes had ruptured 1 week earlier, my circumstances and options would have been exactly the same, thus making women in such situations and in a position to be affected by the pending legislation real. My second response is much more important. Know that women who make decisions to terminate a pregnancy, Mr. President, especially in the second trimester, do not come to their decisions lightly. As practicing Catholics, we actually considered whether or not we should let nature take its course, and then decided that my life and the need of our daughter to have her mother were more important than betting on a miracle. We have our son's framed footprints in our living room, and I have saved his hospital blanket along with other mementos from the pregnancy. He has a memorial tree in a national forest, and donations are made annually in his name. Benjamin was my son, and yet I chose to take a course of action that would prematurely, granted only by a couple of hours, end his life because it was the best option for my family. Please, Mr. President, don't insult her. She says, please don't insult me and other women like me, or unlike me for that matter, by assuming that we don't already consider absolutely everything, including things you could never even imagine, to legislate about in making such an impossible decision. Sincerely, Christine. Her story is real, Mr. President. Her story is telling you that it's not your place to make decisions for her. You can't imagine the collateral consequences of your choice. Mr. President, you don't know what it's like to be raped, to have to deal with incest. You don't know, Mr. President, what it's like to deal with it and how long it may take before you even get to the place to be able to make any decision about anything, because it's numbing. The violation, it stays with you forever. You don't know the things that trigger thoughts about it. And even when you look away, Mr. President, as if I'm not speaking to you, it's real. It's real for women, Mr. President. Even when you look away when I'm speaking to you, for the women whose choices that you're making for them in your mansplaination, like the governor, it's real, Mr. President, and they have the right to make the choices for themselves, because you don't know, Mr. President, the horrific things that people go through when they get to that place. Mr. President, no woman should have to be all the way at possible death before her doctor can make the choices with her that are best for her. Instead of being in women's wombs, Mr. President, could you work on jobs? Could you do that, Mr. President? Because that's what the people elected you for, not to be in their wombs.